Miss Marple and the Silent Bell Ringer. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like the petals of a midnight rose. I'm your host, Connor, and tonight I invite you to step into the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where even the most familiar sounds can hide the deepest secrets. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know your corner of the globe. Now, settle in with something warm to drink, find a comfortable spot, and let's unravel this mystery together through the eyes of Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 1. The Rope That Swung Alone. The March evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular stillness that precedes spring, when winter's grip has loosened, but the warmer days have not yet arrived. Inside the village church, two groups pursued their weekly activities with the dedication that had characterized them for decades. In the main sanctuary, 20 voices rose and fell in practiced harmony as the choir worked through their Easter repertoire. Above them, in the bell tower, 6 bell ringers pulled their ropes in the intricate patterns of change ringing, creating cascades of sound that had marked time in the village for 3 centuries. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual place in the third row of choir stalls, her hymnal open before her, though she needed no reference for these familiar anthems. Her voice, thin but true, blended with the others as it had for 40 years of Tuesday evenings. Yet even as she sang, her attention was divided. The bells overhead provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the choir's melody, and Miss Marple, who had lived her entire life within sound of these bells, could recognize not just the patterns being rung, but the individual ringers by the distinctive way each handled their rope. The vicar, Reverend Thomas Clement, stood before the choir with his customary earnest expression, hands conducting with more enthusiasm than precision. He was a good man, Miss Marple reflected, perhaps too good for his own comfort. He worried excessively about his parishioners and took their troubles deeply to heart. Just now he was focused entirely on achieving a particularly tricky harmony in the anthem's bridge, his face creased with concentration. It was precisely 8:15 when the bells stopped. Not a gradual conclusion as one might expect at the end of a pattern, but an abrupt cessation that left a single rope swinging wildly. The sudden silence was so startling that the choir faltered, voices trailing off in confusion. Reverend Clement lowered his hands, turning his face upward as if he might see through the ancient stones to the bell chamber above. Miss Marple noticed several things in quick succession. First, that the bells had stopped mid-pattern, something that in her 4 decades of Tuesday evenings had never occurred. The bell ringers of St. Mary Mead took their art seriously, and to abandon a sequence incomplete was unthinkable. Second, she observed that only 5 bells had been ringing in the moments before the silence, though 6 ringers had ascended the tower stairs at 7 o'clock. She had counted them herself, as she always did, a habit born of a lifetime of careful observation. Third, and most troubling, she noted the expression of genuine alarm that crossed the face of Mrs. Barbara Finch, who sat 2 rows ahead. Barbara's husband, Harold, was the captain of the bell-ringing team, a position he had held with pride for 15 years. The look Barbara gave the ceiling suggested she had recognized something in that sudden silence that the rest of the choir had not. Reverend Clement excused the choir with an apologetic gesture and hurried toward the tower stairs. Several choir members rose to follow, including Miss Marple, who moved with the careful deliberation of her 76 years, but with a purposefulness that suggested she expected to find something significant. The tower stairs were narrow and worn smooth by centuries of feet. The door at the base stood open as it always did during ringing practice, and the single flight of stone steps spiraled upward to the bell chamber. Miss Marple, following several steps behind the vicar, noted that these stairs were clearly visible from the choir stalls. Anyone descending would have been seen by 20 pairs of eyes. The bell chamber, when they reached it, presented a scene that would puzzle the village for days to come. 5 bell ropes hung in their proper positions, still swaying slightly from recent use. The 6th rope, the treble bell controlled by the captain, swung wildly as though someone had released it only moments before. But of Harold Finch there was no sign. His coat hung on its customary peg. His mobile phone sat on the small table where the ringers kept their belongings during practice. His keys lay beside it, the familiar keyring with its St. Christopher medal catching the light from the single overhead bulb. Even his half-drunk cup of tea remained, still faintly warm to the touch. but Harold Finch himself had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail. The other bell ringers, still in the chamber, looked thoroughly bewildered. Young Timothy Green, who rang the second bell, seemed on the verge of tears. Sarah Matthews, the newest member of the team, had gone quite pale. The others, Edward Porter and James Wilson, elderly ringers who had practiced this art for decades, simply stared at Harold's empty place with expressions of complete incomprehension. The vicar began asking questions, his voice rising with each query. When had they last seen Harold? Had he said anything about leaving? Might he have felt unwell? The ringers responded with increasing confusion. Harold had been there just minutes ago, they insisted. He had been ringing his bell, calling out the changes, leading the team through their practice. Then, quite suddenly, his rope had gone slack. They had looked over to find him gone. Miss Marple remained silent, but her mind was working with the methodical precision that had solved more than one village mystery. The tower had only one entrance, the door through which they had all just climbed. That door opened onto stairs that had been continuously visible to the entire choir. The windows in the bell chamber were narrow slits, designed centuries ago for ventilation and light, far too small for a person to pass through. The bells themselves hung in their frame above, accessible only by ladder, and that ladder stood unused against the wall. Harold Finch had entered the tower at 7 o'clock. He had not been seen leaving, yet he was no longer here. It was, Miss Marple reflected, quite the most interesting puzzle St. Mary Mead had presented in some time. Chapter 2. The Pattern That Shouldn't Have Broken. The police arrived within the hour, summoned by Reverend Clement's somewhat panicked telephone call to the local constabulary. Detective Inspector Arthur Craddock, who had worked with Miss Marple on previous occasions, took charge of the scene with professional efficiency. He was a solid, practical man who had learned through experience not to dismiss the observations of elderly ladies, particularly those who had lived in the same village for 7 decades. Miss Marple had remained in the bell chamber, settling herself on the wooden bench that ran along one wall. She appeared to be merely resting after the climb, but her eyes continued their careful cataloguing of details. The 5 remaining bell ringers had been asked to wait in the church below, and Barbara Finch had been summoned from choir practice to answer questions about her husband's recent behaviour. Inspector Craddock examined Harold's belongings with meticulous care. The mobile phone was an older model, its screen locked but showing no missed calls or messages. The coat pockets yielded nothing unusual: a handkerchief, some loose change, and a partially consumed packet of peppermints. The keys included those for the Finch home, Harold's car, and what appeared to be a key to the church vestry. Miss Marple spoke quietly from her place on the bench. "Inspector, if I might make an observation." The detective looked up, his expression indicating he was indeed willing to hear whatever she had noticed. She continued in her gentle voice, which nevertheless carried clearly in the stone chamber. "The bells stopped at 8:15 mid-pattern. I believe they were attempting grandsire triples, a rather complex sequence that takes approximately 12 minutes to complete. They had been ringing for about 8 minutes when the disruption occurred." Craddock made a note in his book. "How can you tell which pattern they were ringing?" "Oh, one learns to recognize them after so many years," Miss Marple replied with a modest smile. "More significantly, grandsire triples requires all 7 bells. They were ringing with only 6, which means Harold had already stopped before the pattern was abandoned." The others continued for a few more minutes before realizing their captain had gone. The detective absorbed this information with a frown. "So he could have left earlier than we thought, perhaps as early as 8 o'clock. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. That would seem logical, except that young Timothy Green quite clearly stated that Harold called out the next change only moments before his rope went slack. Change ringing requires the conductor to call instructions to keep the pattern correct. If Harold had left earlier, the pattern would have collapsed immediately. Inspector Craddock descended the stairs to interview the ringers again, this time with more specific questions about the exact sequence of events. Miss Marple remained behind, ostensibly to rest, but actually to examine the chamber without the distraction of other observers. She noted the thickness of the stone walls, the solid construction of the floor, the absence of any concealed spaces or hidden doors. The chamber was exactly what it appeared to be, a simple medieval room designed to house bell ringers and nothing more. yet Harold Finch had disappeared from it as completely as if the stones had swallowed him. Barbara Finch arrived at the church just as Inspector Craddock was concluding his interviews with the bell ringers. She was a composed woman in her mid-50s, her greying hair pulled back in a practical bun, her clothes sensible and well-worn. But Miss Marple, watching from the church doorway, saw the tremor in Barbara's hands and the tightness around her eyes that suggested deeper distress than simple worry about a missing husband. The interview took place in the vestry, but Miss Marple, who had taken a seat in the front pew ostensibly to rest before her walk home, could hear every word through the thin door. Barbara described a Harold who had seemed increasingly distracted over recent weeks, missing the occasional practice, making excuses to avoid social engagements, spending long hours in his study with the door closed. When pressed about whether there had been any arguments or domestic troubles, Barbara hesitated before answering. "He was worried about our son," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "Martin has been having some difficulties in London. Nothing serious, but Harold was concerned. He had been trying to help, though he wouldn't tell me exactly how." Miss Marple filed this information away with all the others. An adult son in London with unspecified difficulties, a father growing increasingly distracted and secretive. Money troubles, perhaps? That was often the root of such mysterious behaviour. The search of the bell tower that followed was thorough, or at least appeared so to the untrained eye. Inspector Craddock had 2 constables tap every stone, examine every corner, and investigate every possible space large enough to conceal a person. They found nothing. The tower was solid stone, its walls nearly 3 feet thick, with no cavities or hidden chambers. The floor was likewise solid, the ancient timbers supporting the bell frame showing no signs of disturbance or concealment. Miss Marple watched this search with interest, but she said nothing. There was something about the tower that troubled her, some detail that didn't quite fit, but she couldn't yet identify what it was. She had learned over many years that such intuitions were worth pursuing, even when they couldn't immediately be articulated. As the evening drew on and the search proved fruitless, Inspector Craddock made the decision to expand the investigation. Harold Finch was officially declared missing, and inquiries would begin into his recent activities, his financial situation, and any personal troubles that might have driven him to a voluntary disappearance. The bell tower would be sealed as a potential crime scene, though no evidence of any crime had been found. Miss Marple accepted a ride home from Reverend Clement, who was deeply shaken by the evening's events. During the short journey, he spoke anxiously about Harold's character, his dedication to the church, his leadership of the bell ringers. It simply wasn't like him to abandon his post, the vicar insisted. Harold took his responsibilities very seriously. If he had needed to leave, he would have said something, made arrangements, not just vanished without a word. Miss Marple agreed that it was most unlike him, but privately she was thinking of something else entirely. She was remembering Barbara Finch's face when she had mentioned her son's difficulties in London, and the way her hands had trembled when she said Harold had been trying to help. There was more to this story than a simple disappearance, and Miss Marple suspected that understanding Martin Finch's troubles would be key to understanding his father's impossible vanishing. Chapter 3. The Hollow Sound in Ancient Stones. The following morning brought a development that intensified the mystery considerably. Harold Finch's car, a modest blue sedan, was found parked in its usual spot behind the church. His wallet, containing his driver's license, credit cards, and approximately £50 in cash, was discovered in the glove compartment. This effectively ruled out any theory of Harold having left the tower and then driven away while the choir's attention was distracted. Miss Marple learned of this discovery over morning tea with her friend and neighbour, Dolly Bantry, whose husband served as a church warden and thus heard all church business promptly. Dolly, who delighted in village mysteries almost as much as Miss Marple herself, was full of theories ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Perhaps he had a stroke and wandered off in confusion, Dolly suggested, adding cream to her tea with a generous hand. Or perhaps he staged his own disappearance for insurance purposes. Or he could have had a secret lover and they fled together. Though I must say, Harold never struck me as the romantic type. Miss Marple listened to these speculations with polite interest, while her own mind worked on the problem from a different angle. She had spent a restless night thinking about the bell tower's construction, about priest holes and secret chambers, about the long history of the church and the many modifications it must have undergone over the centuries. This morning she had a request to make of Reverend Clement, one that would require some delicacy. She found the vicar in his study, surrounded by historical records he had pulled from the church archives. He looked haggard, as though he had slept little, and he greeted Miss Marple with obvious relief at the distraction. She accepted his offer of tea and spent several minutes in gentle conversation about the parish Easter preparations before broaching her true purpose. "Reverend Clement," she said carefully, "I wonder if you might permit me to examine the bell tower again. Not the chamber itself, you understand, but the structure. I have a particular interest in medieval architecture, and it occurred to me that St. Mary Mead's tower might contain features that have been forgotten over time." The vicar looked puzzled but agreeable. "What sort of features?" "Priest holes," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Secret chambers where Catholic priests could hide during the times of persecution. Many churches in this region were built with such spaces, though their locations were often kept secret and sometimes forgotten entirely after they ceased to be needed." Reverend Clement's expression shifted from confusion to excitement. "Good heavens, I never thought of that. You think there might be a hidden chamber in our tower? And that Harold somehow discovered it and is hiding there? It seems worth investigating," Miss Marple said mildly, "though I wonder why he would choose to hide and from what." The vicar gave permission immediately, and by mid-morning Miss Marple found herself once again climbing the tower stairs, this time accompanied by Reverend Clement, Inspector Craddock, and a structural surveyor named Mr. Peacock, who had been hastily summoned from the neighbouring town. Mr. Peacock carried various instruments for detecting hollow spaces behind walls, and he set about his examination with professional thoroughness. Miss Marple, meanwhile, conducted her own investigation using methods that required no special equipment beyond careful observation. She moved slowly around the chamber, trailing her fingers along the stone walls, pausing occasionally to tap gently with her walking stick. The others paid her little attention, focused as they were on Mr. Peacock's more technical approach. It was near the eastern wall, behind where the bell ropes hung, that Miss Marple found what she was looking for. A crack in the mortar between stones, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. But more than that, a faint draught of air that shouldn't have been present in a solid wall. She tapped the stones with her walking stick, listening carefully to the sound they made. "Mr. Peacock," she called softly, "might you bring your instruments to this section? I believe you'll find something of interest." The surveyor approached with his electronic detector, running it across the stones where Miss Marple indicated. His eyebrows rose. "There is definitely a cavity behind here," he confirmed. "Quite a large one, in fact. I'd estimate perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, running floor to ceiling." Inspector Craddock moved forward immediately. "Can we open it? How would we access it?" Mr. Peacock examined the crack more closely, then ran his hands along the stones. "If this is indeed a priest hole, there will be a mechanism to open it from the outside. They were designed to be accessed quickly in emergencies." "Ah, here we are." He pressed a particular stone that sat slightly proud of its neighbours. With a soft grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark space beyond. Reverend Clement gasped. Inspector Craddock reached for his torch, and Miss Marple simply nodded as though she had expected exactly this. The hidden chamber was perhaps 7 feet long and 5 feet wide, with a ceiling that followed the slope of the tower roof. It was entirely empty of any historical artifacts, but it was very obviously not empty of recent occupation. Plastic water bottles, several dozen of them, sat stacked against one wall. Tinned food, enough for perhaps a week, filled one corner. Blankets, a camping stove, matches, and a small first aid kit completed the supplies. Someone had been preparing this space for occupation, and recently. The water bottles bore date stamps indicating they had been purchased within the last month. The tinned food was all of recent manufacture. This was not some historical curiosity, but an actively planned hiding place. But of Harold Finch there was still no sign. The chamber was empty of any person, living or otherwise. Inspector Craddock examined every item carefully, looking for fingerprints or any identifying marks. The supplies were generic, purchased from any supermarket, bearing no distinctive features, but the sheer quantity and careful selection suggested planning, forethought, and purpose. Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the priest hole, her keen eyes taking in every detail. She noted the ventilation shaft that led upward to the tower roof, explaining the draft she had detected. She observed the scratch marks on the floor where heavy items had been dragged in. She saw the modern padlock mechanism that had been installed inside, allowing someone to secure the door from within. "This changes everything," Inspector Craddock said grimly. "Harold didn't stumble upon this space by accident. He discovered it, prepared it, and intended to use it. The question is why?" Miss Marple had her own theories about that, theories that were beginning to take firmer shape as more pieces of the puzzle emerged. A hiding place prepared in secret, supplies for an extended stay, and a father with a son facing unspecified troubles in London. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the full picture remained frustratingly just out of reach. Chapter 4. The Research That Revealed Too Much. The discovery of the prepared hiding place shifted the investigation's focus entirely. What had begun as a mysterious disappearance now appeared to be a carefully planned act. The question was no longer what had happened to Harold Finch, but why he had chosen to vanish, and whether he was still hiding somewhere in the church tower or had used the priest hole as a staging point for a departure elsewhere. Inspector Craddock ordered a more thorough search of the tower and the church grounds, but Miss Marple suspected this would prove fruitless. Harold had planned too carefully to leave obvious traces. Instead, she turned her attention to understanding what had driven a respectable middle-aged church warden to create a secret hiding place and stage his own disappearance. Her investigation began, as it so often did, with gentle conversations over tea. Barbara Finch, when Miss Marple visited the following afternoon, was a woman barely holding herself together. The house was tidy, but had that quality of neglect that comes when someone is going through the motions without real attention. Barbara served tea mechanically, her hands shaking as she poured. Miss Marple, settling herself in the comfortable sitting room, began with condolences and expressions of concern, before gently steering the conversation toward the questions that mattered. "You mentioned that Martin had been having difficulties in London. Might I ask what sort of difficulties those were?" Barbara's composure crumbled. "Financial," she whispered. "He's being accused of taking money from his employer. A great deal of money." Miss Marple made no judgment, merely nodding encouragingly. Barbara continued, her words tumbling out in a rush as though they had been held back too long. "Martin works for an investment firm. Last week he called to say they had discovered irregularities in the accounts he managed. Someone had been moving money between accounts, and Martin was the only one with access. He swears he didn't do it, but the evidence seems conclusive." "How much money?" Miss Marple asked gently. Barbara closed her eyes. £120,000. The firm is pressing for prosecution. They want to make an example of him, they said. Martin could face years in prison. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm that came from understanding human nature in all its complexity. And Harold had been trying to help, trying to find the money to repay it, Barbara confirmed. He thought if he could make restitution, perhaps they would drop the charges. He remortgaged our house, withdrew our savings, sold his coin collection, everything of value we owned. But it wasn't nearly enough. He had only managed about £15,000. The picture was becoming clearer, but Miss Marple sensed there was more to the story. "When did Martin's troubles begin?" she asked. Barbara's answer was immediate. "About 3 months ago, when the irregularities were first noticed, but the money had been moved over a longer period, perhaps 2 years. They're still investigating exactly how it was done." Miss Marple made her way home thoughtfully. The next morning she visited the church office where records were kept, including the bell ringer's schedules and Harold's own notes as captain. Reverend Clement, eager to assist in any way possible, gave her unrestricted access to Harold's locker in the bell chamber, which the police had already examined and released. The locker contained the usual detritus of regular attendance: spare rope, rosin for grip, a thermos for tea, and several folders of sheet music for changes. But tucked at the back, behind a stack of old ringing society newsletters, Miss Marple found something more interesting. A folder containing photocopied pages from historical documents, all relating to the church's medieval history. The documents detailed the persecution of Catholics during the 16th and 17th centuries, the hidden priests who had maintained their faith in secret, and specifically the architectural features churches had incorporated to protect them. Several pages focused on St. Mary Mead's own history, including a reference Miss Marple found particularly enlightening, a notation from 1796 that mentioned sealing certain chambers that had fallen into disuse and presented structural concerns. Harold had been researching the priest hole, learning of its existence from historical records, and then systematically searching for it. The scratch marks around the opening mechanism suggested he had discovered it several weeks ago. He had then prepared it for occupation, purchasing supplies gradually so as not to attract attention, and planning what appeared to be an extended stay. But why? That remained the central question. Miss Marple returned to the evidence, laying out what she knew in the systematic way that had served her well over the years. Martin Finch faced prosecution for embezzlement of £120,000. Harold had been desperately trying to raise money to repay it. He had failed to raise enough. The prosecution was proceeding, and then Harold had vanished, creating a mystery that consumed police resources and village attention. The pattern suggested a distraction, but to what purpose? Miss Marple considered the timeline. Martin's arrest had apparently been scheduled, though Barbara hadn't mentioned exactly when. Harold's disappearance had occurred on Tuesday evening. If the arrest had been planned for that week, Harold's vanishing would indeed have created a significant distraction, particularly if he remained hidden for several days. Her hypothesis was interrupted by a visit from Inspector Craddock, who had news. "We've been investigating Martin Finch's situation," he reported. "The young man is indeed facing serious charges. What's more interesting is that his arrest was scheduled for this Friday. That's tomorrow. When Harold vanished, we diverted resources to search for him, which meant the officers who were supposed to execute the arrest warrant were reassigned to the search." Miss Marple nodded. "So Martin's arrest has been delayed indefinitely at this point. We simply don't have the manpower to conduct both investigations simultaneously, and a missing person takes precedence." The inspector paused, looking troubled. "You think Harold disappeared deliberately to delay his son's arrest?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we should examine Harold's recent activities very closely, particularly any contact he might have had with Martin, and we should perhaps look into travel arrangements that might have been made in the past few days." Inspector Craddock's eyes widened as he grasped her implication. "You think he was buying time for Martin to flee the country?" Chapter 5. The Son Who Stole for Love. Inspector Craddock's investigation into Harold's recent activities revealed a pattern of communication that confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Harold had purchased a second mobile phone 3 weeks earlier, paying cash and using a false name at a small electronics shop in the neighbouring town. This phone had been in frequent contact with Martin's number in London, sometimes as many as a dozen calls per day. More damning still, Harold had visited a travel agent 2 weeks ago, again in a neighbouring town where he was unlikely to be recognised. Using cash, he had purchased a one-way ticket to Brazil, departing from Heathrow on the Friday following his disappearance. The ticket was in Martin's name. Brazil was significant, Miss Marple noted when Inspector Craddock shared this information. The country had no extradition treaty with the United Kingdom for financial crimes. Martin could live there indefinitely, beyond the reach of British law. Harold had been planning his son's escape, and his own disappearance was meant to provide the distraction necessary for Martin to reach the airport undetected. But where was Harold now? That remained the pressing question. The priest hole had been empty when discovered, though it had clearly been prepared for occupation. Had Harold hidden there initially and then left? Or had he planned to hide there but changed his mind? The bell ringers who had been present all insisted Harold had been in the tower chamber with them, ringing his bell, until the moment of his disappearance. Timothy Green, in particular, was adamant that he had heard Harold's voice calling changes right up until the pattern broke. Miss Marple requested permission to interview the bell ringers again, this time individually and in more depth. Inspector Craddock, who had come to respect her insights, agreed readily. Over the course of 2 days, Miss Marple spoke with each of the 5 ringers who had been present that Tuesday evening, always in her gentle, sympathetic manner that encouraged people to share more than they intended. Young Timothy Green was her first subject, interviewed over tea and biscuits in Miss Marple's cottage. He was a nervous young man of 23, devoted to bell ringing with the intensity of someone who had found meaning in a precise and demanding art. He described the Tuesday evening practice in detail, how they had been working on grandsire triples, how Harold had been in good spirits, making jokes and offering encouragement. He called out the changes himself, Timothy insisted. I heard his voice quite clearly. He was standing right there at his rope. And then, suddenly the rope went slack, and when we looked over, he was gone. It was like he just vanished into thin air. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. You're quite certain you heard his voice, not just the sound of his bell? Timothy paused, really thinking about the question for the first time. Well, I heard the calls for the changes, but now that you mention it, I suppose I was focused on my own bell and the pattern. I assumed it was Harold calling because he's always the one who conducts. But the voice could have been recorded. Could it have been recorded? Miss Marple asked gently. Timothy considered this. I suppose so. Harold had been making recordings of practices lately, said he wanted to study the patterns and improve our timing. He had his phone set up on the table recording. I never thought anything of it. This was significant. Miss Marple thanked Timothy and moved on to her next interview. Sarah Matthews, the newest member of the team, provided another piece of the puzzle. She mentioned that Harold had asked her 2 weeks earlier whether she might be willing to arrive early for practice to help him test some new recording equipment. They had spent half an hour before the others arrived, with Harold recording various calls and then playing them back to test the audio quality. I thought it was odd at the time, Sarah admitted, but Harold was so enthusiastic about improving the team's performance that I didn't question it. He said he wanted to make training recordings for new ringers. Miss Marple was beginning to see how Harold had accomplished his impossible disappearance. Her final crucial interview was with Edward Porter, the most experienced ringer after Harold himself. Edward was in his 70s, a retired engineer with a precise mind and careful habits. When Miss Marple asked him to describe exactly what had happened when Harold disappeared, Edward's answer was illuminating. It's been troubling me, he admitted. The timing doesn't quite work. I've been ringing for 50 years, and I know how long it takes to ring any given pattern. We started grandsire triples at 8 o'clock precisely. I checked my watch because I wanted to time how long it took us to complete it. When the pattern broke, I checked again. Only 8 minutes had passed. But grandsire triples takes at least 12 minutes. We couldn't have been as far into the pattern as I thought we were. Unless, Miss Marple suggested carefully, the pattern had actually been interrupted earlier, and you continued for some minutes without realizing Harold was already gone. Edward stared at her. The recording? You think he used a recording of his voice calling changes, so we wouldn't notice he had left? That's a possibility worth considering, Miss Marple replied. She was now confident she understood the mechanism of Harold's disappearance, but there remained the question of where he was now and what his ultimate plan had been. The answer came from an unexpected source. Barbara Finch, who had been staying with her sister since Harold's disappearance, returned home briefly to collect some clothes. When she entered the house, she found signs of recent occupation. Food had been taken from the pantry, clothes were missing from Harold's wardrobe, and most tellingly, the spare set of car keys that usually hung in the kitchen were gone. Harold had been hiding in his own house. While police searched the church tower and the surrounding countryside, he had walked home through the back gardens in the darkness and concealed himself in his own attic, a space Barbara rarely entered. He had accessed the house using the hidden key kept under a flower pot, something the police hadn't thought to check since they believed Harold had vanished from a locked tower. Inspector Craddock, informed of this development, immediately authorized a search of the Finch home. They found Harold in the attic, surrounded by the supplies he had originally prepared for the priest hole. He was dehydrated, exhausted, and when the police entered, he simply looked up at them with an expression of utter defeat. Chapter 6. The Father Who Wouldn't Abandon Hope. Harold Finch was taken to the police station, given medical attention for his dehydration, and then questioned about his actions. Miss Marple, who had been instrumental in unravelling his plan, was permitted by Inspector Craddock to observe the interview through the one-way glass. What she witnessed was a man who had gambled everything on a desperate plan and lost. Harold's story emerged in fragments, each piece revealing the depth of his desperation and the extent of his planning. He had indeed discovered the priest hole through historical research, spending months in archives learning about the church's medieval past. The discovery of the hidden chamber had seemed like Providence, offering a solution to his impossible situation. Martin was going to be arrested, Harold explained, his voice hoarse from days without proper water. They were going to put my son in prison for 7 years. 7 years of his life gone, his career destroyed, his reputation ruined. I couldn't let that happen. I had to give him a chance to escape. Inspector Craddock asked about the embezzlement, whether Harold knew why Martin had taken the money. Harold's face crumpled. He took it to pay for his mother's cancer treatment, he whispered. 5 years ago, when Sarah was dying, the insurance company denied coverage for an experimental therapy that might have saved her life. They said it was too experimental, too expensive, not proven enough. Martin emptied those accounts to pay for the treatment. £120,000 for a chance to save his mother's life. The experimental treatment had failed. Sarah Finch had died anyway, and Martin had been left with the guilt of having committed a serious crime that hadn't even achieved its purpose. He had been trying to replace the money gradually, moving it back into the accounts bit by bit from his salary, but an internal audit had discovered the irregularities before he could complete the restitution. Harold had been desperately trying to raise the full amount, hoping that complete repayment might convince the investment firm to drop charges. But the firm, one of London's largest and wealthiest, had been insistent on prosecution. They wanted to make an example, to show that employee theft would not be tolerated regardless of the circumstances. When Harold realized he couldn't raise the money in time, he had formulated his desperate plan. He would create a distraction so complete that police resources would be diverted from Martin's arrest. He would give his son time to reach the airport and flee to Brazil, where he could start a new life beyond the reach of British law. It wasn't about escaping justice, Harold insisted. It was about escaping a justice system that values corporate money over human life. The mechanics of the disappearance had been exactly as Miss Marple had deduced. Harold had spent weeks preparing recorded calls for changes, creating a library of his own voice, conducting various patterns. On Tuesday evening, he had set his phone to play these recordings through a small Bluetooth speaker he had hidden among the bell ropes. While the recording played, making it seem he was still present and conducting, he had slipped out of the tower during a particularly loud sequence of bells and made his way to the priest hole. He had remained in the hidden chamber for only an hour, long enough to be certain the alarm had been raised and police were searching the tower. Then he had used the ventilation shaft to exit onto the roof, descended via the exterior drainage pipe, a route he had tested weeks earlier, and made his way home through the back gardens under cover of darkness. His plan had been to hide in his own attic for 4 days, until after Martin's flight had departed. He believed police would never think to search his own home, assuming he had fled far from St. Mary Mead, but he had miscalculated badly. The dehydration, the stress, and the realization that Barbara had been brought to near collapse by his actions had broken his resolve. Inspector Craddock pressed him about Martin's current whereabouts. Harold's answer revealed the final failure of his plan. Martin had refused to flee. When Harold had called him from his burner phone to tell him the ticket was purchased and the plan was in motion, Martin had been horrified. He had told his father he wouldn't run, that he would face the consequences of his actions, and that Harold must not sacrifice himself for a son who didn't deserve such loyalty. But Harold had proceeded anyway, believing Martin would change his mind when the moment came. He had staged his disappearance, created his elaborate distraction, and waited in his hiding places for news that Martin had safely left the country. Instead, Martin had voluntarily presented himself at the police station in London, confessed fully to the embezzlement, and provided a complete accounting of where every penny had gone. He had explained about his mother's cancer, the denied insurance claim, and his desperate decision to steal from his employer. Miss Marple, listening to Harold's broken confession, felt the familiar weight of moral complexity that so many of her cases involved. A son who had committed a serious crime for the most understandable of reasons. A father who had obstructed justice and consumed valuable police resources trying to protect that son. An investment firm that had suffered a financial loss they could easily absorb, but insisted on the harshest possible punishment. And underlying it all, an insurance system that had denied life-saving treatment, setting in motion this entire tragic sequence. Inspector Craddock concluded the interview and emerged looking troubled. Harold would face charges of wasting police time, making a false report, and potentially obstructing justice. But the inspector seemed to take no satisfaction in this outcome. He had children of his own, and Miss Marple suspected he was imagining what he might do in Harold's position. As Harold was led to a cell, Barbara arrived at the station, her face streaked with tears. She had spoken with Martin in London, and he had told her everything. Now she wanted to see her husband, to tell him that she understood, that she didn't blame him, that they would face whatever came next together. Miss Marple watched their reunion through the glass, two people devastated by circumstances largely beyond their control, clinging to each other as the full consequences of Harold's desperate gambit became clear. Chapter 7. The Hidden Phone That Exposed Everything. The days following Harold's arrest brought a flurry of legal activity and community debate. St. Mary Mead, a village that prided itself on knowing everyone's business, found itself deeply divided over the Finch family situation. Some condemned Harold's actions as irresponsible and criminal. Others expressed sympathy for a father driven to desperate measures by an impossible situation. Miss Marple found herself in the uncomfortable position of having solved a mystery that many in the village wished had remained unsolved. Several church members approached her with barely concealed reproach, suggesting that perhaps she might have allowed Harold his escape given the circumstances. She listened to these criticisms with her characteristic patience, but remained firm in her conviction that truth, however painful, was always preferable to comfortable deception. Inspector Craddock continued his investigation, now focused on documenting the full scope of Harold's planning. It was during a search of Harold's study that the burner phone was finally located, hidden in a hollowed-out book on a high shelf. The phone's message history revealed months of anguished communications between father and son, a written record of Martin's deteriorating situation and Harold's increasingly desperate attempts to help. The messages painted a picture that complicated the narrative considerably. They showed Martin pleading with his father not to sacrifice himself, insisting he would face justice honourably. They revealed Harold's research into countries without extradition treaties, his calculations about how long £15,000 might last in various foreign locations, his careful planning of Martin's escape route. But they also showed something else. Martin's detailed confession of how he had committed the embezzlement, written out as though preparing testimony for court. Miss Marple requested permission to read these messages, and Inspector Craddock, recognizing her unique insight into human motivation, agreed. What she found confirmed her growing suspicion that there were layers to this case that neither the police nor the community had yet recognized. Martin's confession was too detailed, too precise in its accounting. It read like someone determined to ensure all blame fell on himself alone, protecting someone else from investigation. She brought her observation to Inspector Craddock's attention. "Inspector," she said carefully, "has anyone investigated whether Martin actually committed this embezzlement alone?" The detective frowned. "What are you suggesting? That someone helped him?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I'm suggesting that perhaps someone else committed the crime, and Martin is taking the blame." The possibility had never occurred to Craddock. He reviewed Martin's confession with fresh eyes, noting the peculiarities Miss Marple had identified. The technical details of how the money had been moved between accounts suggested expertise beyond what Martin, who was essentially a junior analyst, would likely possess. The access codes that had been used included some that Martin shouldn't have had, and the pattern of withdrawals suggested someone with more authority and longer tenure at the firm. A deeper investigation into the London investment firm revealed information that changed everything. The senior partner who had been most insistent on prosecuting Martin, who had personally pressed police to pursue the case vigorously, who had refused any discussion of restitution in lieu of charges, had himself been under internal investigation for the past year. The firm's compliance department had noted irregularities in several accounts under his control, but the partner, Mr. Geoffrey Blackwell, had deflected suspicion by initiating the investigation into Martin's accounts instead. When Martin had discovered what Blackwell was doing, using junior analysts' access codes to steal from client accounts while ensuring any audit trail led to them rather than himself, he had confronted his superior. Blackwell had responded by framing Martin completely, ensuring that any investigation would find overwhelming evidence of Martin's guilt and no reason to look further. The experimental cancer treatment for Martin's mother had been paid for with money Blackwell had stolen, transferred through Martin's accounts to make it appear Martin was responsible. Martin had realized too late that he couldn't prove his innocence without exposing the complex scheme, and even then, the evidence against him was substantial. Blackwell had been careful, and Martin's access to the accounts meant he could theoretically have moved the money himself. Faced with the choice of a long legal battle he might lose, bringing scandal onto his dying mother, or accepting blame to end the matter quickly, Martin had chosen the latter. This revelation emerged through painstaking investigation by Inspector Craddock's colleagues in London, who began examining Blackwell's financial records once suspicion was pointed in his direction. What they found was a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that had diverted over £2 million from client accounts over 5 years, with Martin's theft of £120,000 representing just a small fraction of the total. Blackwell had used multiple junior analysts' accounts to move money, always ensuring the audit trail led to them. When this information reached St Mary Mead, the community's understanding of the Finch family tragedy shifted dramatically. Harold hadn't been protecting a guilty son from justice. He had been protecting an innocent son from a miscarriage of justice, trying to buy time for the truth to emerge. His desperate measures, which had seemed so misguided, suddenly appeared in a different light. Chapter 8. The Investigation That Cleared a Name. The exposure of Geoffrey Blackwell's embezzlement scheme triggered a comprehensive investigation that eventually exonerated Martin completely. The investment firm, faced with evidence of systematic fraud by a senior partner and their own failure to detect it, quietly dropped all charges against Martin and offered him a substantial settlement in exchange for his silence about their security failures. But for Harold, the situation remained complicated. While public sympathy had shifted dramatically in his favour, he had still committed actual crimes. He had staged a false disappearance that consumed police resources. He had filed a misleading report that led authorities to search for a missing person who was never actually missing. He had obstructed justice by attempting to delay his son's arrest. These were not serious offences in the grand scheme of criminal behaviour, but they were offences nonetheless. Miss Marple found herself in an unusual position, asked by multiple parties to provide her perspective on Harold's actions to the court. Inspector Craddock believed her testimony about the complexity of the case would be valuable. The prosecutor wanted her to confirm the extent of Harold's planning and deception, and Harold's defense attorney hoped she would speak to his motivation and character. She agreed to testify at Harold's hearing, though she was troubled by the moral ambiguity of the entire situation. On one hand, Harold had broken the law deliberately and with considerable planning. On the other hand, he had done so believing his son was innocent but unable to prove it, facing a justice system that seemed more interested in making examples than in finding truth. Was such desperation forgivable? Should it be? The hearing took place in the magistrate's court, with Harold charged with wasting police time, making a false report, and public mischief. The maximum penalty for these combined charges could be substantial, including possible imprisonment. Barbara sat in the gallery, her face drawn but resolute. Martin had travelled from London to be present, his own legal troubles now behind him, but the emotional cost still visible in his appearance. Miss Marple's testimony was brief but precise. She described the extent of Harold's planning, the sophistication of his disappearance, and the considerable police resources that had been consumed in the search for him. But she also described the context. A father watching his innocent son being framed for a crime, unable to prove his innocence, facing years in prison. She spoke of Harold's character, his decades of service to the church and community, his genuine anguish at the position in which he found himself. When the prosecutor asked whether Harold's motivation excused his actions, Miss Marple's answer was characteristically thoughtful. "I don't believe motivation excuses unlawful behaviour, but I do believe it provides essential context for understanding it." Mr. Finch was not trying to help his son escape justice. He was trying to prevent an injustice. The fact that he was correct in believing his son innocent doesn't justify his methods, but it does explain them. The defense attorney presented evidence of Harold's previously unblemished character, his contributions to the community, and the extreme emotional distress under which he had been operating. Character witnesses spoke to his integrity, his dedication to the church, and his reputation as an honest and principled man. The bell ringers testified as a group, describing Harold's leadership and his obvious anguish in the weeks before his disappearance. Most compelling was Martin's own testimony. He described his mother's death, the embezzlement he had been falsely accused of, and his father's desperate attempts to help. He explained how he had begged Harold not to sacrifice himself, how he had tried to convince his father that running was not the answer. When asked why he thought Harold had proceeded with the plan anyway, Martin's answer was simple: "Because he's my father, and he couldn't bear to watch me suffer for something I didn't do." The magistrate listened to all testimony carefully, then took a brief recess to consider the sentence. When court resumed, her judgment reflected the complexity of the case. She found Harold guilty of the charges but noted the extraordinary circumstances. She sentenced him to 6 months' imprisonment, suspended for 2 years, and 100 hours of community service. The suspended sentence meant Harold would not serve time unless he committed another offence within the next 2 years. The magistrate's statement was thoughtful and measured. She acknowledged that Harold had broken the law deliberately and that his actions had consequences beyond his family. Police resources had been diverted from other investigations. The community had been distressed. Other families facing genuine disappearances might find their cases taken less seriously because of hoaxes like Harold's. These were real harms that couldn't be ignored simply because Harold's motivation was understandable. But she also noted that Harold had acted from love, not malice. He had believed his son was innocent and had been proven correct. He had cooperated fully once discovered and had expressed genuine remorse for the broader consequences of his actions. The suspended sentence would allow him to remain in the community, continue his contributions to local life, and demonstrate through his future behavior that this desperate episode was an aberration rather than a reflection of his true character. Chapter 9. The questions that remained unanswered. The resolution of Harold's case brought relief to the Finch family, but it left Miss Marple with lingering concerns about the broader implications of what had occurred. She found herself thinking about the case late into the evenings, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she contemplated the moral complexities that had emerged. The insurance company that had denied Sarah Finch's cancer treatment faced no consequences for their decision. The experimental therapy they had deemed too costly and unproven had subsequently been approved for standard use, saving thousands of lives. Sarah might have been among them had she received treatment when Martin sought it. But insurance companies were permitted to make such decisions based on cost-benefit analyses, and no law had been broken when they denied her claim. Geoffrey Blackwell's prosecution was proceeding, but his wealth allowed him to hire expensive lawyers who were negotiating plea deals that would likely result in minimal prison time. The investment firm had recovered most of the stolen money and was more interested in avoiding publicity than in seeking maximum punishment. Martin had been offered a settlement but no apology, and the firm had made no changes to prevent future senior partners from similarly abusing junior analysts. Miss Marple discussed these concerns with Inspector Craddock over tea one afternoon. The detective shared her frustration with the uneven application of justice. A working-class father who stages a disappearance to help his innocent son faces criminal charges and community opprobrium. A wealthy executive who steals millions and frames junior employees faces a negotiated settlement and likely keeps his pension. The system seemed designed to punish desperation while accommodating sophisticated fraud. The case had also raised uncomfortable questions about the bell ringers and the church community. Several people had noticed Harold's strange behavior in the weeks before his disappearance, but had said nothing, assuming personal troubles were none of their business. Timothy Green admitted he had seen Harold researching the church's history late at night, using a flashlight in the bell tower when he thought no one was watching. Sarah Matthews had noticed Harold measuring the walls, but hadn't questioned what he was doing. The culture of privacy and non-interference that villagers prided themselves on had allowed Harold to prepare his elaborate deception right under everyone's noses. Would earlier intervention have prevented the crisis? Miss Marple pondered this question without reaching a satisfying answer. People were entitled to privacy, but at what point did community have an obligation to notice an act when one of its members was clearly in distress? Reverend Clement was particularly troubled by the discovery of the priest hole. The hidden chamber had been sealed for good reasons after the need for it had passed. Reopening it had allowed Harold to stage his disappearance, but it also raised questions about what other forgotten spaces the ancient church might contain. The Reverend had commissioned a full architectural survey, which revealed 2 other sealed chambers and a network of passages between different parts of the building that no living person had known existed. These discoveries prompted broader questions about the church's responsibility for its own history. The priest holes had been created to protect people from religious persecution, serving a noble purpose in their time. But in the modern era, Such spaces could be misused, as Harold had demonstrated. Should they be permanently sealed again, documented but left inaccessible, or preserved as historical features with appropriate safeguards? Miss Marple's most profound concern, however, related to the questions the case raised about parental obligation and the limits of familial loyalty. At what point does a parent's duty to protect their child end? Martin had been an adult, capable of making his own decisions, and had explicitly told Harold not to sacrifice himself. Yet Harold had proceeded anyway, believing he knew better than his son what needed to be done. She discussed this matter with Mrs. Bantry, who had strong opinions on the subject. Harold had no right to make decisions for his adult son, Dolly declared firmly. Martin had chosen to face justice, and Harold should have respected that choice. But Miss Marple wondered whether parental instinct could ever truly be bound by such rational considerations. She had seen too many parents over the years do foolish, even harmful things out of love for their children. The instinct to protect one's offspring appeared to be deeper than reason, activated by forces that transcended logical decision-making. The village's reaction to the case had also been revealing. Public opinion had shifted dramatically as new information emerged, from condemnation of Harold's irresponsibility to sympathy for his impossible position to anger at the systems that had created his desperation. But this shifting opinion revealed how easily communities could be swayed by narrative rather than by consistent principle. If Martin had actually been guilty, Harold's actions would have been no less elaborate or disruptive, yet he would have received no sympathy whatsoever. Miss Marple recognized that this case, like so many she had encountered, defied simple categorization into right and wrong. Harold had broken the law. He had also acted from love. The insurance company had followed its policies. Those policies had also resulted in a woman's death and set in motion a cascade of suffering. Martin had been framed. He had also initially confessed to crimes he hadn't committed rather than fight for justice. Every actor in the drama had made choices that were simultaneously understandable and questionable. Chapter 10. The Bell Tower That Rang Again. 3 months after Harold's sentencing, the bell-ringing team returned to regular practice. The tower had been thoroughly examined, the priest hole documented and sealed with a modern lock to prevent unauthorized access, and new protocols established for tower security. But the psychological impact of Harold's disappearance lingered over the group like a shadow. Miss Marple, resuming her place at Tuesday choir practice, noticed the changes immediately. The ringers were subdued, their usual enthusiasm tempered by what had transpired. Timothy Green seemed to have lost confidence, frequently making errors he would never have committed before. Sarah Matthews had resigned from the team entirely, unable to face the tower where such elaborate deception had occurred. The group now numbered only 5, barely enough to ring the simpler patterns. Harold himself attended the first practice after his return, entering the church with visible trepidation. He had completed 40 hours of his community service sentence by helping to catalogue the church's historical records, work that had allowed him to remain connected to the community while fulfilling his legal obligations. But returning to the bell tower where he had staged his disappearance required a different kind of courage. The ringers greeted him awkwardly, unsure how to behave towards someone who had deceived them so thoroughly, yet for reasons they now understood. It was Edward Porter, the oldest and most experienced ringer, who broke the tension. "Right then," he said briskly. "We're down 2 ringers and our conductor hasn't practiced in months. We'll be lucky to ring rounds without making a hash of it. Let's get started and remember why we're here." The simple statement restored a sense of normalcy. Bell ringing was an ancient art that transcended individual drama. The patterns they created had been rung for centuries by countless teams of ringers, each bringing their own troubles and triumphs to the tower. Harold's story was unusual but not unique. Churches had always been refuges for people in desperate circumstances, and bell towers had witnessed every human emotion over the centuries of their existence. As the bells began to ring, Miss Marple closed her eyes and listened to the familiar patterns. She could hear the hesitation in Harold's handling of his rope, the uncertainty in Timothy's rhythm, the careful precision of Edward compensating for the other's nervousness. But she could also hear the gradual return of confidence, the ancient patterns reasserting themselves, the comfort of repeated practice overcoming the awkwardness of the situation. The case had taught her something about the nature of community and forgiveness. St. Mary Mead had been quick to judge Harold when his deception was first discovered, equally quick to sympathise when his motivation was revealed, and was now slowly learning to simply accept the complexity of what had occurred. People were neither wholly good nor wholly bad. Actions could be simultaneously wrong and understandable. Justice could be served while mercy was also extended. Martin visited St. Mary Mead that same evening, his first return since his own legal troubles had been resolved. He and Barbara had come to collect Harold after practice, planning to have dinner together as a family for the first time in months. Miss Marple observed their reunion from her place in the choir stalls, noting the careful way they moved around each other, as though each was afraid of saying something that might shatter their fragile peace. Inspector Craddock had shared with her that Martin was planning to leave London, having been offered a position with a financial services firm in Edinburgh that knew his full history and had hired him specifically because of his integrity in ultimately insisting on facing justice. The investment firm where he had been falsely accused had been censured by regulators for their security failures, and Geoffrey Blackwell was awaiting trial. These resolutions brought no one back and changed nothing about what had already occurred, but they represented a kind of closing, a way of moving forward. As Miss Marple made her way home that evening, she reflected on the peculiar satisfaction that came from solving mysteries that had no truly satisfying solutions. Harold would carry the weight of his deception for the rest of his life. Martin would always know his mother had died while he was falsely accused of trying to save her. The bell ringers would need time to rebuild their trust. The church tower would forever be associated with scandal as well as worship. Yet life continued, as it always did. The bells would ring every Tuesday evening, calling the village to recognize the passage of time and the persistence of traditions older than any individual trouble. The church would continue to serve its community, offering sanctuary in all its forms to those who needed it. And Miss Marple would continue her observations, finding in each case the same fundamental truth, that human beings were capable of both tremendous love and terrible judgment, often in equal measure, and that understanding this complexity was the beginning of wisdom. The case of the silent bell ringer had ended, not with triumphant resolution, but with the quiet acknowledgement that some questions had no perfect answers. Harold had been wrong to deceive the community. He had also been right to love his son. Both things were true, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that truth was rarely as simple as people wished it to be. As the last light faded from the sky and the village settled into evening, she was content with having helped reveal the truth, even if she couldn't resolve all the moral complications it had exposed.